The Social Shift with Josie Ipandwa is a podcast platform that allows for every opinion to matter. However, views and opinions expressed by our guests are not necessarily those of the Social Shift podcast and team. If you're watching this program, it means you are halfway through the Social Shift mini-series with Josie Ipandwa. Thank you so much to everybody who's been watching the episodes. Thank you for everybody who's been leaving comments in the comment section and keeping the conversation going. Remember, if you're new to the mini-series, like, subscribe, and click the notification button so you don't miss any updates. We have an episode dropping every Monday, and of course, over the next 6 weeks, or over the past 3 weeks, and the next 3 weeks rather, we will be discussing one or the other topic that is affecting the youth on a deep level. And it's about shifting the mindset of laziness that we have now when it comes to taking an interest in matters of national interest and keeping the conversation going, even in our private spaces. Now, this, of course, would not be possible if it wasn't for the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation, who so willingly decided to sponsor our mini-series to ensure that we encourage young people to participate in conversations that affect us. Remember, even though we are the youth, we are technically the next leadership. The Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is a German international political foundation with more than 100 offices worldwide. The KAS Namibia and Angola office, based in Windhoek, works to promote democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and political participation. Through educational initiatives and socio-political dialogue, it supports good governance and the strengthening of civic responsibility. KAS's work aims to foster freedom, justice, and sustainable development in Namibia and beyond. And so it's important that we have all of these conversations. Now, I've had a myriad of guests in the past 3 weeks. We've had Patrick Sam, we've had Michael Mshelelo, we've had Bomba Shiweda, as well as Tuilika Johannes, and of course, not forgetting Denver Kisting, who've come and shared their ideas on one or the other aspect that we've been discussing. And today is no different. Our guests are, of course, two formidable women who've been doing amazing since their teenage years. Don't calculate their ages, they're forever 16. And they're going to be sharing their ideas with us on the topic, is traditional leadership still relevant in Namibia? Welcome to the podcast, Sharonice Busch and Taimi Iileka-Amupanda. I have to say all of them together. Hi, guys.
Hi, Josie.
Hi, Josie. So, we're talking about traditional leadership. There are a lot of young people who are not really well versed with the idea of there being sort of a dual system that exists, right? And by virtue of Article 66, traditional leadership is also able to function holistically and properly in the Namibian context alongside government and civil law, right? So let's give context. When we're talking about traditional leadership, what do we mean? Who are we talking about? Is it just the chief? Is it the headman? What do we mean by traditional leadership?
So the context is really complex in that traditional societies have existed time immemorial, at least in an African leadership context. And we've had chiefs. Previously, they were even having designations as kings before a constitutional dispensation. So it emanates from that kind of context. The same way we have monarchies and dynasties is where we find African traditional leadership context. So in terms of the Traditional Authorities Act and then obviously the Constitution, we have a chief or a head of a traditional authority who then leads that community. And then under him are senior traditional councillors as designated in terms of our act, and then traditional councillors, and then that is where you would find your headmen and all of that. So there's a designation that obviously then at the very top then has a chief or the head of the traditional community. Yes.
And in terms of power though, because I'm thinking if I am Lucas Ndapuka from Okamatapati and something happens, I need assistance in formal setting. Who's the first person that I run to? Is it the chief? Is it the headman? What does that chain of command look like?
Can I go? Yes. Should I go?
Okay. So I think what I wanted to add on to what Taimi said earlier, Josie, before I answer your question, is that the importance of traditional authorities in the Namibian context is that, particularly with what Taimi have said around, the historical context of where we are coming from as Namibians, as Africans, is that despite us having a constitutional democracy, of us as Namibians voting, we first identify ourselves as Namibians, and by virtue of that also have a strong connotation attached to our culture, where we come from. So traditional leaders, by virtue, in essence, then would be the guardian of culture, in terms of referring to, I'm Sharonice, I'm a Rehoboth pastor from Block B. I would then, now with answering your question, for instance, if I have a farming issue or a land issue relevant in the context of the fact that I'm from the Hartab region or from Rehoboth, if I have disputes around an issue pertaining to a communal farm or so, I would first go to the captain. Obviously in Rehoboth you don't have a chief, but you have the captain, and so that point of entry is then, to answer your question around, even dealing with conflict, you go to your leader first. It does not necessarily mean, Josie, that you disregard the state's functionaries of power, where you have a president, where you've got a cabinet, where you've got a judiciary and a legislature, but at a level where we socialize as people and we interact, that is also where you have, for instance, and I'm sure Taimi can also expand on it, the fact that our culture influences our way of life so strongly that even a head of state, when they go to, areas where there's a traditional authority, that respect is given to the king or the queen or the chief through the head of state, because of the emphasis that we place on culture, and in essence that Ubuntu of I am because you are. I don't know, Taimi.
Yes, it's exactly what Sharnice said. And then also just the fact that with obviously the constitutional dispensation and our legislation coming into effect, is that the legislation that establishes, or rather recognizes, because they've existed before, these traditional authorities, mandates them to work together with the state in advancing state policies. So it's not like they exist in some sort of a vacuum. And you made reference to Article 66, is that we've recognized that customary laws already existed. So now we empower these traditional leaders to continue implementing customary law insofar as it doesn't conflict with the constitution. So there's a synergy between the two, and it obviously then falls under the existing organs of state in order to enable them to advance some of their policies. Because you have to remember, with traditional authorities, they exist at the very grassroots levels, where government will not always reach. So it's almost as if it's a layer of leadership that comes from the bottom all the way up, because then these traditional leaders at the community level then form part of like a traditional council of traditional leaders, which then meets with the state. So it's really a progressional sort of like system that enables grassroots level issues to reach the government. Yes.
Now I want to get into the nitty-gritty of just how it is they do their work, right? Because we've seen, and here I'm playing the devil's advocate, because you know me, and you know I love the drama. If we're looking at first just the advancement of women and children's rights, how it is the state has really done its part in putting that at a forefront. Obviously, because of gender equality principles, the government has really worked hard to ensure that we are inclusive when it comes to women in spaces of employment, in spaces of education, in spaces of accessibility. Sorry, my English words are depleted. But apart from that, it's also about protecting the rights of those that we consider vulnerable in society. Now, when you look at the traditional context, Taimi, we've heard the stories, especially for us Bambus. I don't know, Sharonice and Rehoboth, if it's the same thing. But we've seen the stories. If a husband dies, the woman is most likely to be chased out of a house, and the husband's family comes and takes everything. Or you find the instances where a child is being molested by an uncle in the household. The traditional authorities are perceived by society, and I say perceived because we don't know, we weren't there, but they're perceived by society to not generally put at the forefront of the work that they do the protection of the rights of women and children, and focus on a more patrilineal sort of approach to dealing with conflicts within the nuclear household. So then what are we saying about the purpose that they serve then, if that vulnerability of women and children is not protected?
So I think, look, like you said, it's a perception, right? And perhaps this is why series like this exist, so that we can deconstruct some of those perceptions and perhaps even change that narrative. Is that, yes, there seems to be some historical context to how traditional authorities were run. But like I indicated, that part of their mandate is to ensure or to assist government in the furtherance of its policies. And one of the duties that traditional authorities have in terms of the Traditional Authorities Act is that they work together with the Namibian police in assisting to administer the ends of justice, which includes apprehending, obviously, criminals in conjunction with the Namibian police. So I think while that perception exists, the actual mandate placed on them is one that is in line with the Constitution and a democratic society. Of course, those perceptions may continue to exist, but I would say that in their furtherance of their duties, most traditional authorities actually cooperate with that because it's a legislative mandate that has been placed on them. In terms of inheritances, look, honestly, from a legal context, I would say that when it comes to inheritance is far beyond what we should be expecting from traditional authorities, in the sense that the context of inheritance comes from a cultural and customary practice. And yes, traditional authorities have obviously always administered those customs and codified some of those laws. But we would find that in a traditional context, most of our customary law is actually pro-women and children. The problem,
which one?
The laws that actually exist now
Okay.
do not contradict what is at a national level.
Okay.
The issue comes that despite some of these laws, family members do as they please. The problem that I have seen, at least from a practice perspective, is the lack of information in society. There isn't a law in a traditional authority that I know of at the point of this podcast, at least, that allows some sort of like inconsistent inheritance system. In fact, all inheritances in Namibia should be done in terms, if there was no law, in terms of our Interstate Ordinance Act. And the problem is just that society then does its own things, and you would find that where there's a lack of information, the widow and children do not access the correct platforms to redress those wrongs that happen in society. So it's not necessarily a problem with the traditional authority. And to give an example, I think a week ago I had a conversation with someone who was talking about the fact that her father's family wanted to inherit the cattle and the land where the father was farming, and she went to the traditional authority in northern Namibia. And the traditional authority had various meetings, they resolved the issue, and then they came up with a formula into how some of those things were going to be administered. And I must pause to state that, some of these things are important, and that goes back to the role of traditional authorities, is that whereas you have the master of the High Court, who is the who then deals with the administration of estates, and they basically deal with administration insofar as it relates to your bank account, the shares you had, the house you had. There are really aspects that, in my view, from a practical point and giving harmony to the entire family, so that people can continue to live together harmoniously, that traditional authorities actually continue to play a role even in a modern society, to try and sort of harmonize some of the disputes that exist between families when disputes arise. Because in an African context, you would find, and I've seen it amongst Awambo and Ovaherero speaking people, is that they farm together. Now, when my father dies and he has 7 brothers and they have been farming together, I cannot expect really that when we come with this dispute to the master's office, that it can be resolved in a manner that we may all sort of like find some peace. But traditional authorities, because they have this context, they're able to come in and really navigate some of those disputes, and and really play that important role of providing leadership at that level. And that's why, at least from that cultural perspective, still find application. And I have seen more often than not that they do favor women, obviously, because even in terms of the Communal Land Act, is that if there's a surviving spouse, they would then get the customary land rights certificate that the husband, for example, was holding, because most of the time it's the husband that holds that right, and then it passes on to the surviving spouse, which would then be the woman and the children. children. And if there's no surviving spouse, it goes on to the children. I know that historically, at least in the 1995 and even in the early 2000s, these were disputes we saw ongoing. Now the disputes we see are less and are fueled more by misinformation. And then obviously greed and some abuse of power, because some family members tend to obviously have more power. They abuse that power, and then that is where you see women and children obviously being disenfranchised because of that lack of knowledge or access to some of those institutions that can assist them.
Just let me add.
Add, and then before you add, and then I also want you to cover the context for the Basser and the colored community, because I think one of the things that Namibia as a country are also not aware of is how are things done in non-Oshuambo, non-Herero cultures, because we just assume, you said earlier that you guys have a captain. I didn't know. I thought it was just Captain Fandi Said. I really thought it was just that song, right? But you guys also have a culture, and you have a way of a traditional way of doing things and dealing with disputes. So also in your answer, just add on to how it is you guys address those issues.
Very good. Just to add on to what Taimi have said, I think, Josie, it's also important that we look at how traditional authorities and our traditional leaders have evolved over time. Because I think it's also a conversation of conservatism and how it has met us as Namibia as an evolving nation also, because the world has evolved, right? And Namibia is not an isolated island. We've also changed with how the world has changed. When I speak of this, I really want to give practical examples of how our traditional authority has aligned to what the mainstream community has demanded of it. You have, for instance, our San community. Our San community, as nomads, like we know them, felt that they need to still pasture, and they necessarily, with their kids, move from one grazing area to the next. And back in the day, those kids didn't have access to education. Then we've had leaders that were very passionate around, like what Taimi said, educating them and making them understand the importance of education. For example, a good example that the nation knows of is Dr. Labetina Madila, who made it her work as a deputy prime minister to constantly engage the San community to ensure that even though you want to preserve your culture as a nomad, let's allow our kids to go to school, for instance. So for me, that's a very good example of when Taimi have said that our traditional authorities are not rigid in the way that they work and in the way that they engage with community. They're also subject to change, because as a nation we're changing. For instance, you also then have in Kunene the Ovahimba. The Ovahimba in their culture still have the practice of teenage or child marriages, where you, when you reach a certain age, you in culture may be subject to an arranged marriage by whoever your family has chosen for you. So for me, that also again is, in a constitutional democracy, there may be views to say that that's wrong, that practice is wrong. And so, but what Taimi have said around dialogue and engaging our traditional authorities is important, because if we've had successes around mainstreaming San kids into education, it's the same way we should ensure that they understand the harmful practices of marrying these young women in particular off. Do you understand? So I want to agree with you to a certain extent that more work needs to be done, right? Especially when we speak about women empowerment and so forth, around the conversations of gender equality and so forth, and sometimes harmful practices that still do exist. But I also want them to acknowledge that we must also see that even through our traditional authorities, when we have a conversation of women empowerment, that we have women queens at the highest level. You have hompas in the Kavango regions that are female. And so it also then goes to show that, because you must understand traditional authority, like what Taimi have said, at the very grassroots level, a reflection of who we are. And so if we are getting it right as a nation to have a queen, whether from the north or hompa in the Kavango region being a female, I want to appreciate that Namibians now understand that women are more than just being nurturers. Women are being seen as now an equal actor or equal citizen that can engage productively in nation building, and that they can lead, and that they're qualified to contribute to decision making, and that they can be entrusted with a traditional authority. So I think for a democracy as young as ours of 34 years, we should appreciate the gains that we have made and just consolidate on what we have done. And now reflecting on perhaps also I'd want to say Buster, and most likely also a colored kind of like a culture or background where I'm from. It is also a culture that may not necessarily have a rich history or has evolved over time like others, but it is also a culture that also speaks around how we deal with things, right? So there's also an issue of, immediately when there's perhaps death or when there's marriage, for instance, there's also, because for instance in Rehoboth, we have Samkubes. Samkubes is where you now celebrate your bastard heritage. You have your rituals of how you need to be dressed. The ladies with a white thingy on the top that is tied here behind the chin with the apron, with the dress. The men get onto the horses. There's a whole ceremony just to celebrate who we are as a people and so forth. But I also think that the importance of traditional authorities is that it influences your way of life. So when a colored girl or a bastard girl gets asked for hand in marriage, the elders must sit. And there's also that understanding of van wie sy self is, wie se kind is. So the elders would want to know who is marrying Josie, wie is jou pa, wie is jou ma. So that kind of conversation, because that will then go to the next question: are you capable of taking care of our child? Do you understand? And it's the same, I think, across all of our cultures.
See, we didn't know that. We thought like it's just the I don't want to say the Vambu culture, but the black cultures, because in Namibia there's also a misconception the colors and bastards yellows. Yeah, you guys are in a little island on your own. But we didn't know that there was such a rich history and a traditionalist approach to doing things for you guys as well. And it's important to know that because it gives Namibian youth a new perspective of how things are done in other spaces. So we are also able to relate better to the bastard and colored community, but also when there's an indifference in between the various ethnic groups, that we come from a place of better understanding. And I think it was important that you mentioned that point. Speaking of culture, guys, we are moving into the space of fourth industrial revolution, right? Namibia is trying to grow and everything is moving more into a westernized approach, unfortunately. The way we speak, the way we eat, the way we get married, the way we access and utilize education, the way we spend money, our values. There's a lot more Western influence that is coming into a picture than we would like to admit. Then we have these traditional authorities that are still prevalent on the grassroots level, like you said. Do you think that there is enough of a partnership between traditional leaders and government in the preservation of truly Namibian cultures? Because one might argue that there are so many things that we are letting go of that are pertinent to our identity as a specific cultural group in the face of, we are developing. But at what cost to the preservation of culture?
Yeah, thank you. Because I think that question is even more important when you speak of the preservation of culture, right? I think, like, if we go back to history lessons, I don't know if you guys loved history in school, but when we were taught about like colonization of African countries, right? And we learned about assimilation, what the French did with Francophone countries. Yeah. And it's so interesting because it has started to bother me now that we are sort of being assimilated by Western democracies. Yeah. And I don't think we are intentional about pushing back to a certain extent. The most important thing I want to talk about is language. And we know that there are some languages that are phasing out. And language is the very beginning of cultural understanding.
It is the basis, yeah.
Yeah, so like the way we communicate in our languages informs how we do cultural practices. And because I've had this conversation various times, and I'm like, even with the Shuambo speaking child, when you're growing up, no one tells you that you necessarily need to curtsy when you give something. Yeah. It's sort of like something that just comes from the way in which you communicate. Yeah. But when we start accepting the death of that language, that cultural practice also goes out. And I know, because as a society we now start asking ourselves, like with Gen Z, there are things they do and you're like, what is going on?
And like, we would have been beaten if we do some of the things that these kids do now. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's one aspect that for me is really starting to become more and more prevalent, is that we are letting go of our cultural practices. so much so that it's affecting the way in which we socialize. And so to answer your question, I don't think enough is being done, unfortunately. In fact, I think we are being assimilated into a system we should somehow learn to put boundaries to, because I think cultural preservation is still very important. I've had this conversation with at least anyone who knows me knows I've at least said this to a certain extent. I think of retirement, for example. My parents are retired, right? And I think of where they stay. I mean, we've stayed in Oshakati for most of my life. I live in Windhoek. We have a place we call home in Windhoek. But I often think about what would happen, and God forbid I have to retire at 60, because at this point I feel like even at 55 I'm out. But I'm like, where would I go? Because in Windhoek, I pay rates and taxes. I am not willing to pay rates and taxes to the city of Windhoek when I'm 55. Because that money should just help me to at least be able to afford life. But even more importantly is the fact that I can't own a chicken coop at the back of my house with some goats in the city of Windhoek. Right? And that's a way of African life. If we've always kept goats, we've always kept chicken, and that's how we're able to survive. When I'm back in Omalala, I don't have to think about what to eat. I'll just be like, oh, there's a chicken there. And that's a cultural practice. And the question is, when we are, growing and expanding into some of these communal areas, what exactly are we doing in terms of cultural preservation? Because that's a very important aspect of cultural preservation. And you know where the problem comes? Is that government will at one point have a large social welfare budget when some of these communities can no longer sustain themselves in a modern society that has become townships all over. And for me, that's a serious problem. And I've seen it when we are trying to establish townships, is we just move into communal land, but we don't think about, if you look at South Africa, Stellenbosch areas, those are still largely farmlands, doing what farmlands do, even when you have a sort of like almost a metropolitan on the other side. And there are certain things that have been maintained that do not necessarily then cause some of these lifestyle inflation effects. And for me, that is when I say that a lot still needs to be done in terms of preserving culture. That is where I'm really coming from with that context. I think that remains important, and it's something we actually need to start thinking about as a society.
Absolutely.
I just want to come in, Josie. I think Taimi has done very well of speaking at again, a grassroots level around culture preservation. But I want to throw it back to the three of us. And I know that all three of us are very well traveled. Because the question that you're asking concerns me personally as a young leader who've gone through the ranks of youth leadership, who has also had the privilege of traveling the continent and beyond. So when I travel, for instance, Josie, to Morocco, or I travel to Nigeria or to Ghana, I always come back asking myself, what is our national character?
Yes, an identity.
What do we identify? When I travel to Kenya, besides the fact that they speak Swahili, like with what Taimi said with language, there's always another mechanism through which they identify as a country. Another very, very good example of how language unite is Botswana, where they all speak Setswana, even though they have the other dialects, right? But outside of that, when you come back home, especially after you've traveled, I always ask myself, here we are Namibians, but we're from different cultures. What brings us together as young women from Namibia? And I think that's the question we must ask when we speak about how do we then balance out not losing our character as Namibians against to especially pop culture influence on the young people. When I look at how pop culture has influenced our youth, I sometimes get worried when the elderly ask us, are we really ready to lead, even though they call us the leaders of the future and the leaders of tomorrow? I sometimes ask myself, are we really ready for the mantle of leadership, the level of wisdom that it requires, the level of depth and aptitude that it requires? Because you look at the way pop culture has influenced our youth, that they sometimes lose themselves in the process. Josie and Taimi, let me give you practical examples of what's going on that concerns me. When we were in high school, we took pride in how we wear our uniform. Today you have kids that wear pants that is tight. Our skirts with 4 fingers above the knee, Josie. Today's skirts, if that child bends over, my friend, it is what it is.
And some of them be bending.
And there's the hair issue. You know, for us, it either you had a neat bola or you plaited your hair.
Yeah, no gel was allowed.
My friend,
no
today,
little ribbons.
The kids are more concerned about the what do you call it, the length of the extension
and the edges.
And the what. And I'm like, and we even had shoe shine as young girls and boys. Whether it was a taffy or a grasshopper, you never allowed dust on your shoe. Today's kids, I'm like, and those are small things to me that matters. But outside of that, Josie and Taimi, the question that we then need to ask is, what identifies and brings us together as Namibians? Because when we have identified that, we need to preserve this in order not to lose ourselves, because also through that is how you strengthen your culture, for instance, right? And this for me is very important because we are not all lost as a younger generation. The first thing that we do, guys, when we are hungry is you want to go to Kapana. Young people love traditional food, right? We've not completely gone
I can't go to the north and not eat a bamboo chicken.
Do you understand? Or you even have Basta saying, the Mopani worms, right? And then they even say how they spice it up, but they're not at the frogs yet, by the way.
No, they must come. Guys, frogs are elite chicken. That's what frogs are, especially if you cut off the head, because I know it's the head that scares people.
Also, I can't.
Yeah, that's smack. Me, I personally eat frogs. They smack.
So I just wanted to say that, young people are not all lost. We love traditional food.
Yeah.
To a certain degree, we speak our languages where we have languages that...
Even with the attire, you see now that young people are also starting to embrace traditional attire more. To a matter of fact, we have a cross-cultural interest in dressing code now, where you find Bambus liking the Herero dresses, you find the Damaras wearing Oshuambo dresses and so forth. So you can see that there is an interest. I think it is the lack of understanding of the value of tradition now that is taking us away. And this is why I will maintain that the responsibility is on the traditional authority. Government has a more sort of neutral, generic approach to how do we as Namibians preserve peace and tranquility and stability in the country. But traditional authorities must come to the forefront to say, okay, us as Kwanyamas, we by virtue of the cow, this is what we represent, this is what our totem says about who we are as people. We must preserve that. Now it leads me to my next question. Tribalism.
I was about to go.
Yeah. Tribalism is, I think, also one of the issues that also gnaws away or claws away at the preservation of culture and how effective traditional leadership can be in Namibia. Taimi, I'm going to ask you this question because even just amongst the Awambo people, we have various dialects, right? Morongadis, Mbaranus, Ndongas, Bambus. And it seems that even within this one group of people, the division is loud and to a sad extent proud. How can traditional authorities better assist with harmonizing the various cultures even within a specific area?
Yeah, so great. I thought about, not the tribalism aspect, but actually the more of how society has evolved to an extent that historically, traditional communities existed in the context of one dialect under one leader.
Yeah.
But what you would notice is that now we have different dialects residing under the authority of other traditional leaders who are not necessarily of the same dialect. So I think to that extent, we will see and may continue to see some form of harmonization. Because we now have Akwanyama people residing in Rukolongavi. Because unfortunately, communal land is becoming sort of like constricted in certain areas. So people are looking for places far and beyond where their family units have been for years. So that kind of convergence will obviously lead to some sort of tolerance insofar as it relates to tribalism. But I would also say that from my experience, the context of tribalism is not necessarily within traditional authorities. And the reason I say this is because I would like to believe for the life of me that there is some form of wisdom that comes with being appointed as a traditional leader. It's almost as if you are inculcated into some form of cultural practice that requires you to treat all people equally. In fact, I have attended a swearing in of a headman, and part of the oath they take is to assist all subjects under them as equal people, which I find that they take seriously. The problem I have seen with tribalism, and it's a conversation we can continue having as Namibians because it's high time we had the conversation.
Absolutely.
Is that it comes from the educated amongst us.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we are going to dismantle this, maybe conversation after conversation, but it's a fight we need to take head on because it doesn't appear to be going anywhere. Because at our best, we are all Namibians seeking to achieve what is best for Namibia.
Yeah.
Namibia and its children, who are your children, my children, and Sharonice's children. So they need to live together in harmony. If we can live together in harmony, they should be able to live together in harmony. So I think it's really a conversation young people need to have in terms of how they identify with one another. But what I've also seen is that the more exposed we become, I would like to believe, is the less tribalist we may be.
Yeah.
And I like to use the example of Oshakati where I grew up because we've grown up with various people. We used to make this joke that in Oshakati there is no dialect. There was only Oshishakati. Because we didn't speak Kwanyama, we didn't speak Ndonga, we didn't speak Oshikwambi, we didn't speak Ngajera. Yes, there was like a
Poli. I heard someone say
so there
Poli
was
one day and I was so confused.
and that's what happens. And I know that when I've spoken to some of the friends that I have who grew up in Katutura, is that while they were Awambo speaking, they speak Oshierero, they speak Damaranama, because that's the kind of community they grew up in. And I would like to believe that perhaps it comes from the intentionality of parents at the time, and maybe that's where we need to go back to. But I would say that it's not a responsibility we can solely give to traditional authorities, right? And I think they have a responsibility, obviously, to ensure that even the subjects that reside within their communities live together harmoniously, because I know that there are some communities who then, when they are sort of like in that traditional community, start to cause some sort of disharmony. And I would like traditional authorities to come to the table to identify the fact that it's not about the fact that I speak a different dialect. In fact, we have Awamba speaking people who are under the Kambadembe traditional authority, for example, because that's how far and wide Namibians are residing at the moment. I mean, it's an independent country, so I can literally live anywhere else, right? So I think that it's a conversation, obviously, traditional authorities must have to say that people will and will continue. People are and will continue to live in different communities, even when they are from different tribal lines and different dialects, right? And we need to find a way to live harmoniously amongst ourselves. But also a conversation that young people must have, young people in positions of leadership, and even at the national level, where we go back to our true pride. And that is the pride of being Namibians. First of all, right? As
national
identity. As a national identity, so that we stop seeing tribal lines, because for me it bothers me when the first thing you're asking is what a person is, because I'm a Namibian. It wouldn't matter because tomorrow I can decide to go and live in Rehoboth, so what? You know? And so I think that obviously it's the issue of tribalism is one that requires all actors, unfortunately, to come together. And it starts at a grassroots level, so maybe it's a responsibility we'll give traditional authorities, but even homesteads, heads of households, and then it goes on to the traditional authorities, and then traditional authorities bring it to a national level, national leadership, and then and then it goes as far as the head of state and all other organs of state, because obviously all of us as Namibians will work in environments that are in Namibia, will do things that, concern Namibians. At the end of the day, the goal remains one. So the fact that we keep seeing tribe here and there is one that is honestly very worrisome, but one that we need as a nation to all be intentional about bringing harmony amongst our tribes.
And by all, whether government, whether traditional leadership, whether the nuclear family, it's really everybody. And I think it's important, particularly Taimi, because you said something very important. When we look at other countries, like you said also, you can identify the Tswana. The South Africans, we don't necessarily just identify them because they're good at dancing amapiano. There's a cultural element to them that makes us aware of we are now dealing with the South African. And I think as Namibians, we love peace so much. To a certain extent, I always say we are too peaceful sometimes, that we're not rigorous in defending who we are as a person, as a collective, individual group, right? And that's dangerous, because that means, yes, we can blend in everywhere, but it also means we can't be told apart from the rest.
But
Now, my question to you will be, Sharnice, and then I want you to think of it from the perspective of human rights versus preservation of culture. There are some cultural practices that exist that in the cultural context, they are looked at as, this is just our way of doing things. Like, for instance, you said the Obahimba, the child marriages. We look at the Olufuko Festival, for instance. But if you try to explain Olufuko Festival to a person from the West, they might regard it as inhumane and degrading parading of women. So where do we draw that line, and where do we find the balance between cultural practices that to us in a cultural context make sense, but internationally might be viewed as draconian or might be viewed as completely degrading to a particular group within the culture?
So Josie, also just before I answer your question, which is also very important, on the issue of tribalism, and I really just want to speak on it because recently we've read of an incident in Marienthal, right, where there was a situation around interviews for nurses, and there was a whole, clash between the Nama speaking and Oshuambo speaking. And not so long ago, we had a similar incident in Khobabas where street vendors were again saying, Oshuambos, get out of here, it's for us. So for me, this is a very serious conversation because we must be ashamed that now we have actual incidents that speaks to we becoming a bit more intolerant towards each other as tribes, but also that we are now promoting things that are going to take us back as a country, right? And so I really want to speak on it because it bothers me a great deal that we are now moving towards an era of where we want to normalize regionalism and them and us and not you don't. I really need to get it off my chest because if we're going to go that route, then I think we're headed for a lot of trouble, and
it jeopardizes the peace that we have come to know and enjoy as Namibians.
And I just wanted to add on to what Taimi said, to say that it cannot be the responsibility alone of traditional authorities to correct with such social evils amongst us, right? Yes, there are custodians of culture at a grassroots level or guardians of culture and people, but it also requires a sense of individual accountability and an individual awareness to call out any retrogressive behaviors in our community, to say this is not how you need to deal with things,
even
right?
if it's against our own.
Exactly. And so for me, this is very serious because it speaks to our conversation of and really the third president coined it well when he said that when dialogue fails, countries go to war. But it also, Josie, there's also a saying that says for the nation to thrive, the tribe must die. And that's why I said, who do we identify when we say that we're Namibians, right? And so any instance, any form of tribalism, we've debated together, the three of us, right? Many moons ago. And I never, as a bastard girl, I never...
Many moons.
No.
I'm not sure telling people I'm 21.
A few moons ago. But I never, as a bastard, felt that I was a minor in the presence of you all. And so there was never a issue of one tribe is inferior to the other. And when we see such things happening now, we must nip it in the bud as a matter of urgency, because you cannot escalate. We've read when Taimi said we how good are we at history? We've read of nations that have bled when it comes to issues of tribalism, like Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis, right? And how they have to rebuild from the year of 1994. So for me, it is really to caution that it starts with us, right? It starts with us being in a group of friends. It starts with us in families. We now have kids of mixed descent that are born into black and white families.
Absolutely.
So it really starts with the individual self to condemn tribalism, regionalism,
and go
individualism.
back to our basic cultural principles of respect, dignity, and appreciation of the next human being.
And to say that we are Namibian first before you are anything else. So for me, it's just that call to say that, especially as the youth that are considered the leaders of tomorrow, if we are the ones inciting violence on the basis that Taimi can't go to Walfish Bay because Walfish Bay is for the Bainash, or Bush can't go to the north because she's a bastard, then we are getting it wrong as young people, and our country is not safe with us. So it's really just to call on to the young people to say that now more than ever, Namibia is a youthful population, Josie.
Very
youthful. 3 million, Taimi, over 70% is below the age of 35. Guys, it's real. We are a youthful population. So literally, we are inheriting a system that we need to fine-tune insofar as our state is concerned, but not to take it back. That is my only plea for those that are tuning in and listening to this conversation. To answer your question around harmful cultural practices, Josie, who says that it's harmful? I want to start there. So So, and it really for me goes to say that we need to set our own definitions
and our own standards.
To understand, and we need to define to what extent our culture may be harmful to us. But we cannot be told by someone else that our culture is harmful. I will not allow that. I had a similar conversation with one of our colleagues the other day to say these definitions of unemployment and how we determine the unemployed. Who sets the definition? Do you understand? And it probed my mind to start thinking around the definitions that I know that as a state we've ratified, and I know Taimi as a legal scholar would appreciate that when you've ratified certain international treaties or declarations or instruments, you are bound by them, right? And we're a member of the AU, we're a member of the UN, so obviously they speak to perhaps also to your question around what is predominantly harmful or not, right? But I think at a cultural level, we must also be very cautious not to have definitions come imposed on us to completely take away. Yes, there are instances that we do know, and that's why I think it requires also, it boils down to me on leadership, Josie. Yes. As a leadership, we need to say what is good for our society. Yes. And that is why we were able to mainstream the Sun. And I'm telling you, Josie, that we have done well. You have graduates from the Sun community that are working in the Ministry of Justice as lawyers. And it prides me to see that. And also, again, I'm sorry that I'm all over the place, that I also want to ask is another question. We often refer, and Taimi is a legal scholar, she can come in on this, because it's something that I've asked recently and it was left hanging. When we say that marginalized need to be mainstreamed and empowered, to what point are we continuing going to empower you? Because in my view, when you got an education, you now need to be able to feed for yourself and fend for yourself. So when we're also saying empower, marginalize, and our cultural groups that are of a special interest group, to what extent should the state continue to empower you? At what point are we going to say you must now be able to take care of yourself, right? Because there's always a thing of, especially when we look at our Sun community, that they must be empowered, that they're marginalized, right? And I always ask myself, if the state has provided quality free education for you, do we still need to take care of you after that? Or is it, for instance, through education, is that how we've empowered you? But also with harmful cultural practices like Olofuko, and especially in the Kunene region where we have predominantly conservative practices that still exist, it is up to us to have at a leadership level a conversation around what is acceptable and what is not.
What is safe and what is not.
I don't know, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I think, the thing is, while you're talking of harmful cultural practices, the thing that came to me is actually, we have harmful cultural practices and what is perceived to be harmful cultural practices. And then we just have the basically keeping up with the advancement of the world and how far the world has come. And this was a conversation I was having in terms of financial inclusion and access to financial institutions. Because some of our people who live, and I want to use maybe the Kunene region as an example, is that they do subsistence farming on communal land. They sell goats and cattle. Some do bartering systems still in this day and age. Others sell obviously now for exchange with our currency. But the issue is that some of them are still not banking with banking institutions. And we've had the advancement of financial crimes and all of these things, and some of our people still don't have access to these things. So it prevents them from being able to even access some of these institutions. So when they come to law firms and you require them to provide you with a tax certificate, for example, someone like that has never heard of NAMRA. So it's not just, while we speak of harmful cultural practices, we must also look at how society is advancing and how it has left some behind. Now, when we look at harmful cultural practices, the debate may continue. And it's a conversation I was having around, how the Indian people do arranged marriages. And I mean, if you speak to some people from the Indian culture, they will tell you, oh no, it's not the best. I met a girl and I fell in love with her and I was required to go back home and marry. And here yet we are in a society where young women and young men are struggling to find suitable partners. And now all of a sudden, people want to have the conversation about arranged marriages coming back. So when we speak of harmful cultural practices, we have to look at the reason the cultural practice was invented. For example, female mutilation. And we've debated about this. Genital mutilation. We've debated about this. And guys, for the life of me, we can't find a good reason as to why that is a cultural practice, especially in Western Africa. What we've known from research is that it was because it then makes girls less likely to engage in sexual activities and prevents them from getting pregnant at an early age. But is it a good thing? Surely not, right? But then there are certain cultural practices. For example, when boys go to head animals and whatever, all of those things. Someone from America may consider that, oh no, the children are young, but it's something, and I'm sure both of you have learned it, like when you are rearing children, there's things that contribute to their growth and fine motor skill development that people in their cultural practices do that someone else would be like, no, you are too young. But a child that you send to go head animals when they are 5 years old, they can identify that cow. They can tell you how many of those goats came back. So they learn how to count.
Yes.
So the thing is, some practices may need to be regulated. But whether or not they are harmful is debatable depending on the context. Because I don't expect someone from a different culture to understand that.
Correct.
I didn't head animals when I was 5 years old, but I'm just saying that I can understand why you are teaching a child to be responsible at that young age. Because it also teaches responsibility, and it's about what they're accessing at a young age. And we keep talking about this now, like we live in houses that are sort of like just confined. You don't even know your neighbor. You don't see your neighbor every other time. And
There's
it's
no
about
sense of community.
interaction. And then you find children who are not socially developed. And we have seen it with COVID children because they saw no one, they knew no one, right? So the question of harmful cultural practices needs to be informed by the reason the cultural practice exists. If there is a scientific explanation as to why certain things are done. And I know that in African context, it wasn't always about science, but it was about how things have been and will be done. And we now can see some of those benefits. There are things that for the life of me have no benefit, and of course those must be discontinued. But we must obviously understand the context of each practice before we simply ban it and say, oh no. And maybe it's also for our parents and even those that are custodians of culture, being traditional authorities, to actually find a way to inform us about why certain practices exist. I mean, that's why few years, maybe many years ago, that government together with the University of Namibia and the Faculty of Law then went on an expedition to sort of codify some of these laws and actually have books that inform us what are the customary practices and laws of some of these traditional communities that we have within our society, because it's important for us to be able to look back at those things and know why certain cultural practices exist, why they are done. Why, for example, in most communities, for a certain act you get to pay a cow because they consider it a one head of cattle because they consider it to be of more value and all of that, and all of those things. And someone will tell you, yeah, but then I mean, if you sell it, it's only worth 10,000. But it's not so much about the currency that you are attaching to it. It's about the fact that it can give birth. If it's a cow, it can give birth to 3 more heifers, and then you're able, there's all of those things. But if you don't understand those cultural reasons behind some of it, you will just be like, yeah, no, that's not fair, and then we can go have a debate about what is right and what is wrong.
Ladies, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our episode, but I want to thank you so much, because what you have done is you've given context. And for a lot of young people, I think that's what's been missing, especially on the conversation regarding traditional leadership. Context and understanding why traditional authorities exist, why they're allowed to exist in tandem with government, and what purpose they serve in society. And I really hope that this ignites a conversation that can go further beyond the podcast, into the homes, into the traditional spaces, at the weddings when we are under the tree waiting to be fetched at the gate, in Rehoboth after the drag racing while we are waiting to go home. These are the conversations that we expect to take further, and particularly in the area of tribalism, to ensure that there is cohesion amongst all Namibian people whilst we work towards finding our national identity. Taimi, Sharonice, thank you so much. Really appreciate you guys. And for everybody who's watching, keep the conversation going in the comment section. Taimi and Sharonice will, of course, be watching the comments and will be engaging with you guys. And as you heard, they love to engage, so the comment section will be on fire. If you haven't liked or subscribed yet, please like, subscribe, and click the notification button to make sure that you are abreast with all of our future announcements. This has been the 4th episode of The Social Shift with Josie Ipandwa, and I'll see you guys again next week. Once again, thank you to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation for making this possible. I'll see you guys next week.